Let's talk about patching and why knowing patching is important for the Cloud Plus exam. Now, when it comes to understanding patching, generally a lot of the patching you're going to do is going to be infrastructure as a service. And this will be mainly to ensure that your host operating systems have the proper level of patching. For example, generally, hypervisors will likely be patched by the cloud provider. However, in some managed services, you may still need to address that. But generally, the main points to get here is that you may need to patch your applications, operating systems. There may be storage updates, network updates, could also be cluster-based updates as well. Now, when it comes to patching platform as a service, generally, the patching will not be done per se for the host OS or anything. That's going to be done by the provider. That's all in the background generally with platform as a service. But generally, if you're the developer or you're running a platform as a service for your developers on a cloud platform, they'll need to update the applications, for example. They may need to update the code, depending on the platform, maybe the runtime environment as well. And of course, APIs. Generally, the main area that can definitely be overlooked could be the APIs. Now, when it comes to AWS, for example, we do want to be aware. And again, for the exam, it's vendor neutral. I just wanted to point out a few things to give you ideas. For example, in AWS, there's a tool called EC2 Systems Manager. So this is a way we can manage our patches in AWS, for example. And this is a really nice way to deploy EC2 instances in AWS and ensure that when an image is deployed, that it has the correct level of patching that you have set from an organizational perspective. So just be aware that this is just a solution in AWS that can be used. And Azure has a similar service as well as GCP. For the exam, we don't need to memorize this because it's vendor neutral. I just wanted to give an example. Now, when it comes to patching, for example, some things to consider. Patching generally has standard operating procedures and methods. You'll, of course, want to understand what they are. For example, in Windows, you may want to install a service pack. If it's a Linux box, then, of course, you'll want to unzip the appropriate, download the appropriate patches from a GitHub, wherever you're going to get them from your maintenance provider. Also, a lot of the cloud providers do provide some level of support here as well. So just be aware from a perspective of patching, you want to handle patching as well a little bit differently than, for example, if you're deploying in production versus like development or even QA. And in reality, in development or quality assurance or test, you have more flexibility in how you deploy your patches generally, at least from my experience. In production, that was very strict. There's a lot of change control to go through. So just be aware that you'll need to address that. Now, on the exam, the main points to get here is that we need to understand the standard operating procedures that may be in play and any methods. Also, too, one note is to inventory your VMs and apps as well. For example, way to address patching really effectively, for example, is to create basically a group of instances. In Google Cloud, for example, we have what's called an instance group. And that instance group will be basically virtual machines that are the same config. And that'll allow us to roll out the patches, to update those patches, and ensure that everything in that group is updated in an appropriate manner. And that's just one of the things to maybe think of as well. Now, rolling updates, we're going to use these generally to ensure, for example, where we may have, let's say, 20 VMs in an instance group. Well, we may not want to update all the virtual machines at once. we want to perform a rolling update. And this is simply where we're going to go out and upgrade that patch on one VM after another. And then when it's finally completed, then that whole release will be considered done for that instance group. And doing one VM, making sure it works, and then doing another is a way to mitigate risk. For example, in AWS, we could use a blue-green deployment model. Here's an example of a simple diagram where we have a blue service and a green service. And basically, the blue service may be live, and the green service is really the backup to the live, for example. This is just one way that we could deploy a service and to maintain availability. Also, too, generally when it comes to blue-green deployment model or an A/B deployment model, sometimes you'll hear as well. This is generally a great way to also set up load balancing and auto scaling as part of the deployment. Now, when it comes to failover, a cluster is going to be a group of servers that work together to maintain high availability of applications and services. For example, if one node goes down, then basically another node will take over and maintain that cluster. One more thing we want to think about when it comes to maintaining patching or updates, we want to be aware that we should prioritize our patches, we should identify dependencies, we want to also look at operating systems as well. And again, for example, we want to think about it from a perspective of Windows and Linux, but also different versions of Linux and different vendors of Linux. Even though it's open source, they could have very different requirements between, for example, Kali or Ubuntu. Applications as well as their updates. For example, if we're deploying on a AWS, a Google Cloud, or Azure virtual machine, there may very well be updates that need to be made to that application based on the cloud platform. So we need to look at those requirements. Also, too, another thing that we need to look at could be around dependencies. And what I mean by that is maybe the patch is only going to be required for a specific Intel platform like Broadwell or Haswell. Lastly, a tip here for you. We want to think about it before we take the exam is to really just understand why we want a blue-green deployment, and also how do we perform a rolling update, and why do we want to perform a rolling update. For example, blue-green deployments, this is a technique to reduce downtime, and we're doing this by running two production environments at the same time. One called blue, one called green, and also note this is also known as A/B testing as well in the development world.